So let me, let me start by saying I know little about Jamaican political economy. My knowledge has increased infinitely in the last 24 hours, but only because I started from a base of 0. So I'll make these comments more general. I like the Henry Miller paper, but I think it set up a straw man in yet another sense, and that is that a lot of the literature has moved away from simply the primacy of institutions to introduce the notion of culture. One thing I'm thinking of, one really nice paper and a research agenda is research by Guido Tobolini. Guido started out as being, in much of his career, really set on the idea that institutions matter, but as he puts it, he now believes that culture trumps institutions. And why does he believe that? Because one very nice paper that Guido has is he looks at outcomes across regions in Italy. By looking across regions within a given country, he can control for formal institutions. Formal institutions have to be the same. Not surprisingly, what he finds, as many other people have found, is that in spite of similar formal institutions, outcomes in northern Italy and outcomes in southern Italy are quite different. And following, let's say, the work of Putnam, he argues that's because even though de jure institutions are the same, de facto institutions are quite different because of different histories and cultures. I was thinking of this when I looked at the data on governance that Susan Collins gave us, that when you look at areas where Jamaica and Barbados look so different, rule of law, political stability, these clearly aren't formal institutions that differ. As Peter said, the formal institutions, given the English heritage, may be the same, but there clearly is a difference in de facto institutions. And as an economist, I always hesitate to use the word culture. Maybe that's why I can hide behind the shield of Guido Tobolini. But his work has shown that culture really matters. And one of the interesting things there, one of the ways he showed it, is he showed that, in fact, the closer you get to the border for certain issues, the Italian border, the closer you get to Switzerland, that's what really matters. That's the sense of culture. And that's what one should put into. Let me make one other comment that was just sort of suddenly, I thought of when Eddie Lazear made the comment. When you said that the cultural revolution mattered, what I thought of was not simply the fact that you moved the status quo, but you probably changed social classes a lot as well. In looking at the history of Germany, what is often argued is that after World War I, the mistake that the Allies made is not invading Germany. Why was that a mistake? Because they didn't really change the social classes that much. The social classes that were there before the war remained, whereas in World War II, the social structure of Germany was very much changed. Now, I'm not going to argue that that was the cause of the growth miracle in Germany, but that's yet another example where changing something like that matters quite a bit. And from the little I've learned in the past 24 hours, and Damien made this point right now, it seems that the history is important not only for the institutions, but also for the social relations that one has seen in Jamaica relative to a place like Barbados.
This is obviously very, very interesting. I just want to add one more variable that, surprisingly to me, has not been introduced yet, neither in the paper nor in the discussions or addenda so far. The word is, well, two words: financial development. So I didn't get any information from the paper or from in the few days that I would have had time to go check it. I would actually like to know whether there are important differences between the two islands in terms of the level of financial development, microstructure, access to credit, the patterns of interest rate, and so on. Because in the development literature, access to credit and the level of financial development of a country seems to be one of the most important variables. Of course, I agree with Alan that also cultural differences and other things could be at play. But first, I would go for economic variables first. Other things that would be perhaps still important, but maybe quantitatively less determinant, would be what are the incentives to innovate. What are there are some parameters in which you can see like flexibility and in the degree of innovation, how the flexibility to move out of a sector and level of balancedness of investments in different sectors and so on. And third would be, for example, how much of, instead of looking just at total expenditure and total size of government and saying whether, and judging in a sort of semi-ideological way whether more or less bigger or smaller size of government is good or bad, I would like to know, for example, how the money is spent. So I would like to know whether, for example, the expenditure on infrastructure, on construction of a network of logistical supplies and transportation and so on, how that, for example, which seems very important in other experiences of development, what's the percentage of that and what was instead, So I would go, I agree with the people in the panel who said that matters are much more complex than just talking about 2 or 3 macro variables. I would like to know, in order to understand where to put your finger in a normative way, first I would like, it would be important to really have a list of these things and with much more precise data. I don't buy the point that necessarily there are political failures, because that's almost a tautology. You can have political failures in one country or another, and there is, if I don't know what type of credit market or other market imperfections you have behind the creation of political failure, I don't understand how we can explain the difference between 2 countries on the basis of political failure.
Thank you. I think in looking at Jamaica versus Barbados, an interesting question which has not arisen is the role which agriculture plays. In fact, if you look throughout all the Caribbean islands, Jamaica is the only one that has really held on to plantation sugar. All the other islands did away with that. And the fact that Jamaica has held on to this and has tried to support it through government policy, government subsidies, etc. There might be a story there. I'm not quite sure what the story is. But just looking on inflation levels, it is very clear to me that in islands where agriculture is almost non-existent, the inflation levels tend to mimic inflation levels in the United States. In Jamaica, it's and Guyana, 2 countries that have agricultural sectors and try to protect them in one way or the other, that inflation levels are way off the scale.